Welcome to the Ruthless Criticism Podcast. This is a podcast which examines the work and ideas of Karl Marx as it relates to various topics. Today we're going to talk about freedom. Good old American freedom. And freedom in general. Probably more general than American freedom. As many of my listeners probably know, freedom is an often discussed topic by libertarians and right-wing types of all sorts. It is often a criticism of socialism or communism. And while that criticism may play out well in the theater of propaganda that is American media, it's probably not too convincing for anyone who's thought about it for more than 10 seconds. So I thought I would break this down by discussing two different concepts of freedom. And similar to how we talk about negative or positive rights, I'm going to talk about negative and positive conceptions of freedom. The negative concept of freedom is primarily concerned with the prevention of intervening moral agents in one's decision-making process or the ability to act on those decisions. The more frequent or effective the intervention, the less freedom. In this conception, man is man's first and only antagonist. Nature is essentially just a circumstance. Think, if you will, a lion that has cornered you into a tree versus a man who has thrown you in a jail cell. By contrast, what might be expressed as a positive conception of freedom is the expansion of available choices within the decision-making process and the ease with which those decisions can be achieved. The more choices, the more freedom. The easier the choices are to achieve, the more freedom. Also in contrast then is the primary concern here. The positive concept of freedom can be said to be primarily concerned with natural antagonisms. That is to say, nature is man's first antagonist, other men are his second. As someone who held the latter conception of freedom, Marx is often maligned by the libertarian-styled right wing. However, in the German ideology, Marx presents a simple argument which acts not only to make a strong case for this notion of freedom, but also as the bedrock for historical materialism. Marx says, since we are dealing with Germans who are devoid of premises, we must begin by stating the first premise of all human existence, and therefore of all history. The premise, namely, that men must be in a position to live in order to be able to make history. But life involves, before everything else, eating and drinking, a habitation, clothing, and many other things. The first historical act is thus the production of the means to satisfy these needs, the production of material life itself. And indeed, this historical act, a fundamental condition of all history, which today, as thousands of years ago, must daily and hourly be fulfilled, merely in order to sustain human life. End quote. Putting aside all the other possible dangers that exist in nature, this first and primary requirement of man's natural condition, namely the need to sustain themselves, immediately limits the choices that man can make at any given time. Although in a period of great plenty, it may be a choice when to eat, it's not a choice not to eat. Likewise, insofar as the means of acquiring food are limited, so too are we incapable of deciding how much time we're going to devote to food. The negative conception of freedom skirts around these issues essentially by ignoring the question altogether. It's no mystery why the right wing continues today to devote itself to things like equality under the law, conceding that equality under nature can't be had. But this ignores man's central role as a shaper of nature. Just as a beaver builds a dam, humans create the conditions in which they live. They do this by developing material resources necessary, by advancing technology and knowledge, and most importantly, by entering into social relations with their fellow humans. In this sense, the negative conception of freedom, as expressed by modern libertarian types, commits something of a double fallacy. First, it ignores what is man's natural condition. That is to say, if man is going to be differentiated at all from other forces of nature, it's important to examine the degree to which we aim to and do actually shape it. Second, even if we were to ignore the fact that man is in itself a force and product of nature, and therefore a part of nature, the acceptance of natural inequality is essentially a giant naturalistic fallacy, essentially considering the natural inequalities between different people to be a desirable constant. In their own defense, it is often claimed that these natural inequalities are not so much desirable as much as they are unavoidable. Phrased in another way, however, natural inequality is little more than differences in the amount of freedom that varying individuals have. Whether or not one person has more or less freedom relative to their fellow humans, however, mankind enters into social relations in order to expand that essential freedom. Barring the intervention into decision-making by other moral agents, that is to say, barring any violations in the negative conception of freedom, two men would only find it desirable to enter into such an association were they to believe that it would increase the positive notion of freedom. It seems then that the natural impetus for man to enter into any social relations at all must necessarily be the expansion of positive freedom. It is, however, equally possible to conceive of a situation where the expansion of one individual's positive freedom results in the diminishing of another individual's negative freedom. But contrary to the intuition of our libertarian friends, this only presents itself as an option not in times of absolute scarcity, but in times of relative surplus. It serves little use for one individual to enslave another, for example, if the labor of a single individual is only capable of providing for the subsistence of one individual. While our hypothetical oppressor may receive some temporary reprieve, without the labor of one able to produce enough surplus to cover the needs of two, the oppressed individual withers with time, inevitably leaving the oppressor right back where they started. Such exploitative social relations then cannot be achieved or sustained unless surplus is guaranteed. As soon as surpluses wither, so too does the population, and so too does the initial social relationships. It's no doubt then why conditions of extreme surplus provide the largest capacity for extreme exploitation and oppression. As such, bourgeois society, with its extreme technical and industrial advantages, transforms oppression in a way no earlier society could. Although the relative wealth inequality of past societies may have seemed extreme, by today's standards, the differences between the wealth of a king and that of a slave are quite small. Only with the development of the modern means of production does the relative surplus produced exceed so greatly the desire for consumption that wealth begins to accumulate in the abstract, and only under these conditions can men find themselves entered into social relations where for the first time their major crises are that of overproduction instead of underproduction. It is only because of these peculiar social relations that, as we mentioned in our previous podcast, Marx was enabled to conclude modern bourgeois private property is the final and most complete expression of the system of producing and appropriating products that is based on class antagonisms, on the exploitation of the many by the few. Equally so, it is only because of these peculiar social relations that Marx was able to conclude socialism, in place of old bourgeois society, with its classes and class antagonisms, will be an association in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. If you like this podcast, or you found it insightful in any way, please leave a comment, thumbs up, and as always, make sure that you subscribe.